It's great to see so many agents of impact on the call, as is always the case. So many of you could and should be speakers. There's just a ton of talent in the room. I think we had something north of 225 RSVPs. Folks who've been on these calls know the drill now, which is introduce yourself, your organization, if you like, and where you're coming from, kind of geographically or temperamentally today, and what your connection is to sort of the ownership economy, as we're calling it. Let me bring in my colleague, Roody Senatus, who many of you know. He's been all over the beat for the last couple of years. Roody, hi.
Hey, David. Thanks so much for having me today.
Let's welcome the guest, and then we'll have a little. Actually, before we do that, let's welcome the guests. We usually have folks say hello, but because we're trying to rush through it, I'm just going to name you all. And we have Jon Shell from Capital Partners, I think in Toronto. Hi, Jon. We're going to have by pre-recorded video Malini Moraghan from the Essential Owners Fund, which is many folks don't know yet, but will, and we'll bring her in a minute. Alison Lingane from the Ownership Capital Lab. Hi, Alison. I think folks may be aware, and it may be already signed up, but if you're not, Ownership Capital Lab is doing its own webinar directly following this, and we'll have a fun showcase. So we'll send the link in the chat, and we'll also at the end send you right off to get more of this ownership stuff with Alison. Michael Brownrigg from Apis and Heritage. Welcome, Michael. And we'll say this again and again, but congratulations on the Skoll Innovation Award that I think you'll be receiving next week, I believe, in Oxford, England, and that's a terrific honor, and congratulations. And then finally, Jack Moriarty from Lafayette Square Institute. Welcome, Jack. And let's say two more things before we get going. Lindsay, take yourself off mute. I want to thank the Sorensen Foundation, the Sorensen Impact Foundation, which has been a great partner in so many things that we've been doing at Impact Alpha. And I wanted to give Lindsay a moment to briefly introduce your new ownership grants. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, David. Thank you. I will be brief. It's great to be with you all today. I'm excited to be part of this webinar on employee ownership. As David said, I'm with the Sorensen Impact Foundation, where we believe ownership is a key driver of economic empowerment. Ownership isn't just about assets, it's about agency, equity, and opportunity. It's how we close the wealth gap, strengthen communities, and ensure more people share in the success they create. So that's why we launched the 2024-2025 Empowering Ownership Funding Program to support bold ideas in employee, home, and community-based ownership models. Out of 100 proposals, we selected 6 groundbreaking organizations working to reshape access to ownership and capital, 3 of which are with us today. Our host and incredible leader, Impact Alpha, the Aspen Institute, and Lafayette Square Institute. Funding for Impact Alpha will enable them to deepen their focus on advancing alternative investment models that promote asset ownership, particularly in historically excluded communities. For the Aspen Institute, the funding will focus on employee ownership and neighborhood real estate. And their initiative aims to shape investment criteria and support policy shifts that drive wealth building opportunities through ownership. And last but not least, my dear friend Jack at Lafayette Square Institute is advancing innovative solutions through policy initiatives and data analytics focused on new incentives for market-based wealth building. We're committed to continuing to fund leaders in the movement to make ownership more accessible and equitable for all. We're at a critical time to turn our attention and, more importantly, our funding to the ownership space. We must address critical gaps in capital, governance, and market access in order to help reshape the economy in ways that foster wealth building opportunities for historically marginalized communities. So with that, I'll kick it back over to David, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And it's great to work with you and with Sorensen in so many ways. And we're also delighted to be working with the Aspen Institute in increasing number of ways. And Ida Rademacher and Matt Helmer have been real leaders on this ownership beat. And Matt, the employee ownership forum is coming up in DC in I think April 9th and 10th. Can you give us a short preview?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And thanks for having us and for all you do. And thanks to Lindsay and Sorensen for their support of our work as well. As David mentioned, we're having the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum on April 9th and 10th in DC. This is the third year we've done it. We do it in strong partnership and collaboration with the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. And the forum really is a place where we try to bring together policymakers, philanthropy, finance, business, advocacy, academia, media, and others to try to push employee ownership in particular into the mainstream of political thought, but societal thought as well. We have a few key goals with the forum where we're trying to put it more in the front of minds of policymakers as they think about how it fits within their agenda, trying to get them to think about how employee ownership can create a stronger and fairer economy. But it's also a place, like I said, where we bring together this wider ecosystem of actors involved in employee ownership to kind of reflect on the moment we're in and how we can really move together as a movement under one big tent to hopefully grow employee ownership within the U.S. This year's theme is what we're calling From Workers to Owners. So we'll have a number of conversations that really try to dive into what benefits ownership creates for workers and how it improves their work, how it improves their job quality, how workplaces really look different in employee-owned companies and facilitate participation and engagement of their employee owners, and ultimately how all of that also translates into good business performance and business outcomes. So we're going to have some interesting conversations on that. But we're also going to be looking at other things that ownership contributes to, such as how it can help strengthen our manufacturing base and supply chains, what it means for the future of work, particularly in this time now where we're, in this conversation around artificial intelligence and technological advancement. What can employee ownership do kind of within that context? We're going to look at how we can unlock institutional investment. Some of our speakers today, including Lindsay and Alison and Jack, are going to be a part of these conversations. And then we're going to look at what ownership looks like within small businesses, as well as what it looks like within the healthcare sector, and have just a number of phenomenal speakers joining us throughout the 2 days. We're unfortunately sold out in person for the forum. There may be some openings on day 2. If you shoot me an email, maybe I'll just squeeze you in there. But
tell them Impact Alpha sent you.
Yeah, but we are open virtually as well. We'll be live streaming and recording. So hope to see some of you there. And thanks, David, for allowing us to stop by and plug this.
Great, thanks, Matt. Maybe for the online part, can you put any kind of link or
Yep, I'll drop that in the chat.
And folks to the right place. Okay, Rudy, you've been all over the beat. What are you seeing?
David, I like to say that this is the most interesting beat in the world right now. And there's so much innovation happening across many different structures of employee ownership, from ESOPs to EOTs to worker-owned co-ops and others. We're seeing, these structures being used for different companies of different sizes, the companies with large workforces who are looking to get a share of ownership of the companies that they're driving value for. And private equity is joining the group as well with their broad-based employee ownership structures that allocate profits to employees of their portfolio companies. It's all exciting.
Great. Well, let's give folks a little a taste of the variety. And you had a story this week or last week, I think, actually, on the first employee ownership trust in Canada. And John, are you in Toronto?
I am.
Did I get that right? Yeah. So give us the brief state of play in north of the border. I know there's been a lot, Canada's been kind of in the news lately, at least in the States.
Do we make your news? It's certainly all the news up here.
And what's up with these employee ownership trusts, and maybe just tell us also what social sorry, your group is Social Capital Partners is up to.
Well, honestly, let's skip the social capital partners group part. That's not that interesting. We'll go
Okay.
right to the Canadian employee ownership.
Great.
So, look, for about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, a group of us started advocating for more employee ownership in Canada. We don't have anything like the ESOP, or didn't have anything like the ESOP or like the UK's EOT. Last June, the Canadian government instituted our own employee ownership trust, based mostly on the UK's version of the employee ownership trust, with some, ESOP-like elements as well, and attached to it a $10 million capital gains tax incentive. So that was the beginning, really last June, of employee ownership in Canada. We have very few employee-owned companies up here. David, you look like go
Well,
on.
I was just on the capital gain. That means the owner, the selling owner, the business owner, who's going to then get some kind of windfall from selling his company, gets a capital gains tax. I just want to make sure folks understand what that means.
Yes. So if you sell to an employee ownership trust in Canada, which means selling at least half your business to an employee ownership trust, you as the seller, the first $10 million of capital gains on that sale are now tax-free.
Great.
And up in Canada, that's about a $2.5 million savings. So a meaningful amount of money. We think businesses up to about $20 million, that will be influential on their decision. Since then, we've seen a lot of action up here. So the first EOT completed a couple months ago. There are probably a couple dozen in the pipeline that will complete sometime likely this year. As you might imagine, recent events vis-a-vis the US have caused a lot of turmoil in business up here. And so some of those deals have been put on hold, but we're hopeful that they will resume. So we'll see how that plays out. I wouldn't be as optimistic today as I would have been 2 months ago when it comes to.
That's interesting because we sort of made a little bit of hay out of that it was the employee ownership was actually having a kind of national sovereignty spin to it, as well as obviously a share of the wealth spin to it. So
over time, I would expect. Well, why don't we get to that in a second? But I do want to talk about the sovereignty aspect and how it can be meaningful both in Canada and elsewhere. But we have now Employee Ownership Canada with a new CEO, which is a fully fledged employee ownership association up here that's doing great work under the leadership of the new CEO, Michael Rass. And, both political parties, we have an election coming up, are engaged in the idea of employee ownership. And we are hopeful that some of the issues with every country has issues with their legislation. We have some with ours. It's really new up here. And so over the next couple of years, we hope whoever wins the next election will start to work on making it a much better policy that will encourage more people to do it. But as you said, the main selling point of employee ownership up in Canada, and I think that's been true elsewhere, is the economic populist angle, right? So we have, challenges in all Western countries around where wealth is held and where ownership is held. And if you look at the idea of economic populism and what it's trying to achieve, employee ownership is a wonderful part of that platform, whether you're looking at it from the left or from the right. And that was very appealing to Canadian policymakers when we were talking about it over the last 4 years. What's new, or at least what's become more prominent, is the sovereignty aspect. And I'm sure this is also true in the US, and I'm also sure that it's true in the UK. But what employee ownership also does is it keeps companies owned domestically. And up in Canada right now, that's a rallying cry. So we expect that, as things continue to shake out, with regards to Canada and the US, the angle of economic sovereignty will take a leading role in the political side, looking to employee ownership as a tool in increasing Canadian sovereignty. And I assume that will be true elsewhere as well.
Great. Just give us one more beat on the economic populism and how the broader distribution of wealth is has salutary effects across the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a challenge right now with talking about redistribution, right? There's no question about that. There is there's been movement everywhere to say, well, we got to focus on growth and productivity and all of these other aspects before we talk about redistribution. So so economic populism has become a very strange concept that doesn't often benefit lots of people. Ownership turns that on its head, right? And says, if we can achieve more ownership for more people in local communities in around whatever country you're talking about, that achieves economic populism without it looking like redistribution, right? And that is an outcome right now that we need to look to outcomes like that. For those of us on this call likely care deeply about wealth for people who don't otherwise have access, right? So what are the angles that we can use to ensure that can continue in an era where that is unpopular? And ownership may be the best example. And so while we use it as sort of a niche aspect, it needs to be much more front and center. And that means different public policy. In the US, I think there's a lot of work for you guys to do on that. In the UK, we saw last year almost 10% of all transactions sold to their version of the EOT. Like, that is a staggering number. It compares to somewhere between 0.5 and 1% in the US, right? So, we're talking like multiples. And so that's where we need to get to in this moment in order to ensure that there can be some version of economic populism that actually benefits the people for whom it's supposed to benefit.
Great. That's a terrific jumping off point. Everybody, I think, I can hear Jack and Alison's gears working on their responses on that, and others as well. But let's cut in to the video, the pre-recorded video with Malini.
Yes, but I'm very glad to be here.
I know you're busy today. Maybe just let folks know where you are.
I am missing all of you today live because I will be attending the board meeting of a $400 million produce company to talk about employee ownership. And it is a great opportunity that I could not miss, but I'm very glad to be here in this.
I think everybody on the call will completely understand that. And let's just start at the beginning. It's called the Essential Owners Fund. And just tell us, what your thesis is about essential workers and essential owners.
Sure. So the Essential Owners Fund was set up to help essential workers share in the value that they create. I think now after the pandemic, everyone knows what an essential worker is for the most part. And we are really focused on those huge parts of the economy, those huge swaths where humans still drive a large part of value for companies. Given the critical nature of their work, essential workers, really they power companies that range through all different parts of our life. Think, medical transport, think food manufacturing, think senior care, the people who take your grandmother to the restroom, the people who put together the fresh foods that you might eat at lunchtime, the pre-prepared foods, the people who are attending to a variety of our critical needs. And those same workers who are so important to the operating stability of their companies are also living at a level of economic precarity that's just, moral failing, but also bad for their businesses, right? You can't show up to work and be productive if you're unstable at home. And so the premise of this fund was to create different structures and opportunities to be able to help those essential workers share in the value that they create, but also create operating stability for the companies as well as economic stability for the workers.
And just maybe if you could sketch out not a particular deal, but sort of what the basic elements of such a transition might be, what the financing is, and what the steps might involve.
Yeah, so the structure, we're a private investment fund. We target the middle market to test a new kind of thesis in the employee ownership space. We use debt and equity to finance non-control employee ownership positions through any reasonable structure that creates 30% broad-based employee ownership or more. And we are structure agnostic. So ESOP, EOT, share plan, profits interest pool, it is all in scope for us. For example, our capital could be, it's flexible, so it can be sub debt in an ESOP transaction. ESOPs are beautiful when they fit. They don't always fit. And our space needs more tools beyond the ESOP to achieve employee ownership. So part of our mandate and our thesis is to do some of that experimentation. We can also be growth equity in a company that is setting up a restricted stock plan. And we focus on the essential industries because so many of those frontline workers drive enterprise value. And we're actually able to, through financial modeling, show an owner, here's the value that we can model out to show what employee ownership will bring to your company.
And so you take a stake, and then, but then how does the stake get transferred? How do employees actually become owners?
We're, unlike a VC fund where you have founders lining up outside the door looking for capital, or a buyout fund that is on the market and just buying whole companies, we are working with owners who are either, first we start by explaining the value of employee ownership in very enterprise value terms. And they are accepting capital. They're not always looking for capital. They are looking for operating stability or risk mitigation. And so we have two structures. We have a debt with warrant structure and a preferred equity structure. The preferred equity structure really is reserved for highly profitable large companies. The debt with warrant structure, we're seeing way more appetite for that right now. But typically, because we're working and engaging with owners who have majority already, one of two things can happen. They are either working with us for the flexibility of our capital and creating a plan that is 30% or more, and they have the control to be able to do that. And we're able to show them, here's what you get for that, for that dilution. Or we are putting employees into the capital stack along with us. So in a preferred equity transaction, for example, we model for a threshold return, after which a reasonable threshold return, not a private equity traditional threshold return. And then the surplus after that goes into what we call an employee-owned vehicle, because we can use a variety of structures to capture that surplus.
I mean, I can understand why these essential workers, need to get a stake in the companies, and why that might be good for their economic stability. But you've also got to convince the owner to do it. So just kind of make the case of why this is actually going to be a kind of win-win.
A lot of folks often see some of the basic data that, by the way, has been codified by so many terrific researchers. The National Center on Employee Ownership has done a bunch of research. Rutgers, of course, is a main go-to. And a lot of that research has shown very compelling numbers on turnover and just retention. And that is important. And that gets an owner's attention very quickly, for sure. And as well as reduced injury rates and safety. And there's a variety of data that comes in that. I will leave that aside because I think a lot of folks have seen that. And if you haven't, please go look for it. One of the most recent arguments that we went through with an owner, which was really interesting, was where their growth was going to come from. This was a consumer products company, a food manufacturer, small size, a beloved brand in its space, and they were looking to double in size over the next 5 years. And this company, let me tell you, they are selling. There's an exit. There's a big fat check coming in 5 to 6 years, and this group of 80 workers, predominantly Latin women, power so much of the manufacturing. And it was a co-founder that has come back to repurchase the company. And he said, I know that this group powers the company. How can I work with them? How can I share some of this? And we've been talking to him about the debt with warrant structure with the 30% provision, which they've really gotten behind. And one of the things that we laid out was, look, if you want to double in size, that's going to come from 3 or 4 different levers. Pricing is one of them. Employees don't touch that, frankly, right? So let's push that aside. But your other major levers of growth are going to be order accuracy, new product introduction, right? All the new products that you want to create, the frontline intelligence of your manufacturing workforce. You need some rapid feedback loops to understand what's going to work and not. And especially right now in this skyrocketing input environment for food manufacturers. And we laid out 3 or 4 very specific levers. It was very classic McKinsey style. Here's where growth is coming from. And then 4 out of 5 of them, we went, your employees have fingerprints on every single one of those, and not small fingerprints, major, major influence. If you want them running with you as fast as you are running to double your size in the next 5 years, this is what employee ownership will do. It'll be risk mitigation and value creation for you.
Maybe just as we close here, I think folks will be interested in your own path to doing this work. So just maybe sketch out how you've come to be doing an essential owners fund.
I have many stories and different ways to answer that question. For this audience, I think the quick one to say would be, I'm a corporate expat. I trained at many fancy places like McKinsey and JP Morgan and Chicago Booth and Cooper Union. And I spent the first half of my career, first on a trading floor working on corporate bond deals and then covering large corporate food companies at McKinsey. And I've been on hundreds, if not hundreds of just site visits to different places. Very often when I went to site visits, picture, manufacturing facility. My favorite was a commercial lettuce farm on harvest day. It is impossible to not see the human factor and what drives the operation. I will also say, looking what I look like, I often would get head nods from the women often on the working line or in the workforce, on the factory floor, on the plant floor. You get the little like, oh, I see you kind of moment. And so that also makes it impossible to not see the humans. And, there was both a personal connection and a very intellectual one of, I see what you're driving for this company.
And so then really last question, what's the scale of the opportunity here? I mean, obviously there's lots of companies like the ones you're describing. What are we talking about if this all plays out in the next few years?
I love that question because it's really the entire economy. I think every single American company should be at least 30% employee owned. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. And when that happens, we will have a kind of social stability, community stability that I think is something we've all been working for.
Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck today in your meeting. And we'll be waiting to hear and see how that all plays out. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. We're back live. Thanks to Malini, and we don't know. I don't know quite how that meeting went, but we'll find out. But let's that's a good jumping off point to Alison, Lingane, and Ownership Capital Labs. Like I said, you'll have the Essential Owners Fund in the very fun showcase that follows this call. How are we going to ramp up the capital and investment in ownership?
Yeah, well, I just love listening to Molly. She's such a great spokesperson, both for the work she's doing and for employee ownership. And, what she talked about in terms of essential workers. And, we often say that this concept of working poor should really be an oxymoron. And, that's exactly what all of these funds are really working on, is to replace working poor with employee ownership and to create that stability in our economy. And so yeah, just at the top of the hour, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, we do have an employee ownership fund spotlight that includes Essential Owners Fund, also Mosaic Capital Partners, and Common Trust. So these are funds that really span the range of employee ownership models, and we welcome anyone to join us. It'll be recorded if you aren't available to just roll right into that conversation. But, to your question, David, about how do we grow really the capital marketplace for employee ownership, I think there are a number of levers. And, this spotlight is a part of a series that we are doing to help investors really better understand what the marketplace looks like. So that's like table stakes, how, making sure that there's not a confusion of what are the opportunities for investment that are available, and that we're really bringing those forward to investors in a clear way so that they can, learn and understand what's available for investment. And then also that we're bringing new folks from the sidelines who may have been peering in and looking with interest, but have found the space to be harder to get their heads around. So this series of fund spotlights, we also host an accredited investor circle for employee ownership investing. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, please reach out to me. But the idea here is that investors are coming together to learn together about employee ownership investing, inviting funds in to do closed door pitch sessions, and even going as far as sharing due diligence with each other as a way to learn. And that helps the investors who maybe aren't as active also learn and give them what they need to take that step in and stop sitting on the sidelines.
I think the recent report, you've got something like 22 funds that are in the market and are raising, I think, if I recall, something like $670 million collectively. This is the point where I also point out that we've been, with your help and with Transform Finance help and other partners, building a database, and we've got our own fund database. And so there's kind of starting to be these lists of folks that people can find to find opportunities. But is that I guess is 22 a good number? Should there be 220?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good number for where we are right now in our growth. Obviously, we want to see over time. You can think about a pipeline of funds themselves, right? So we have at the front of the pack, if you will, we've got our first two Fund 2s. We've got Apis and Heritage and Mosaic Capital Partners. And for many more institutional investors, if you're not a Fund 4 or 5 even, you're still an emerging manager. So as a space, we need to be supporting all of our funds, whether they're at the Fund 2 stage or the Fund 1 stage or the planning stage, to be successful in those stages and to be ready to move forward into the next stage of that development. So that requires a whole range of capital. Yes, it's investment capital, but it's also, it's PRIs, it's grants, it's guarantees, it's all of the above. So another thing that we are doing is we are hosting a first ever course for philanthropy and philanthropic advisors on employee ownership as a way to help that group of investors understand the range of both their grant capital and their PRI and hopefully endowment capital, and how that can all be applied to this whole pipeline, not only of the funds, but of the ecosystem builders in the employee ownership space to really help advance the field.
Great. I think you're the good person to answer this question, which maybe others have as well, from Catherine Foy, about the difference between the partial but broad-based ownership that folks like KKR and others have introduced, and then this kind of bigger idea of employee ownership. So just make that quick distinction.
Sure. Well, an important part of the growth of our space is having more and more products, more models of employee ownership, and they are all critically important to our growth. So we have, what KKR and Ownership Works is doing is quite different from what many of the funds in this conversation are doing, and it's all so important. So, my understanding of the KKR model is that it's providing options for phantom stock to the workers during the private equity hold period. So it's really incentivizing the growth of the value of the company before the private equity exit. I know that they're working on how do we then get that employee ownership to sort of maintain itself and be more durable over time into the future after the exit. And then, what Malini was just talking about and some of the other models are, she used this 30% threshold, which is what certified employee owned has chosen as their threshold for, what makes you a certifiable employee owned entity. So 30% ownership by the employees in any one of these broad-based models of employee ownership is.
And doesn't 30% also, isn't that the threshold for some tax advantages? Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Let's see. I just noticed Corey Rosen in the chat here, and speaking of experts that should be on the panel, Corey is the world expert on so much of this stuff. So welcome, Corey. Okay, let's move right along. Thanks, Alison and Michael. Alison kind of let the cat out of the bag. Fund 2 for Apis and Heritage, you've been crushing it on Fund 1. So tell us about Fund 2.
Well, thanks, David. I appreciate it, and I just can't start talking without first thanking you and everybody at Impact Alpha for your long history of journalism in this space. Today, more than ever, independent journalism is so important. So I want to make sure we all, pay you the debt that we owe you for your work and your teammates' work. We're very excited. We are having a great time. We are out raising Fund 2. We've had tremendous response. To the question you just asked, Alison, and directly a little bit about what John was talking about, I think it all is about de-risking this space to bring capital providers in who are not necessarily impact first investors, who are not willing to take more risk than the return that they're getting, who are really market rate. It is, I think, and sometimes people don't like this comparison, but it is not dissimilar to microfinance and Muhammad Yunus back in the 70s saying, hey, I think this can work, and everybody laughing at him and nobody believing in him. And now, I think the last count was microfinance is a $200 billion category across the world, heading to $500 billion. That's what this group of people and the other funds who are here and in that 22 list can help do, is de-risk these models and make it clear that you can earn a really good return, not extractive, just a fair return. And then you can help the economy get healthy. You can start to address, not just the moral imperative of helping hourly workers have a real life, be able to afford a vacation and so forth, but frankly, a public policy imperative. Right now, 49% of Americans age 55 to 65 tell the census they have no savings for retirement. So this country is looking at a wave of senior poverty. We have 40 to 50% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. Well, that's not a group of young people or middle-aged people who are saving for retirement. So these models of broad-based ownership can create wealth for people that is meaningful, sustainable, and, frankly, life-changing for the next generation, and begin to really address those kinds of issues in a way that is, as I say, sustainable from a public policy point of view. I want to really, and I'll finish with this because I know we have limited time, but I want to really echo John's point. By the way, John, I sometimes say I live in the great state of California, which aspires to be the 11th province of Canada one day. So we'll see.
We're newly open for business, Michael.
Glad to hear it.
Michael, just so that everyone understands, can you just explain really quickly how your employee-led buyout model works, and
Sure.
give some examples of the deals there?
Yeah, thank you, Rudy, for grounding me there. I will. So we do use the ESOP model, and that is for two reasons, and it's not exclusive of all the other great models, but one, it does have significant tax advantages. Two, it has 50 years of legislative track record and bipartisan support. We used to have a slide in our deck that had Ronald Reagan and Bernie Sanders side by side praising employee ownership. We go ahead and finance typically 100% conversions into employee ownership. In Fund 2, which will be a much larger vehicle, $250 million, so that we can do larger companies and help more workers. We set a target of helping 500 workers get on a path to wealth for them and their families. We're going to wind up surpassing that in Fund 1. But in Fund 2, we're hoping to do 2,500 to 3,000 workers on a path to wealth. And so we finance the acquisition of the shares from the private seller into the ESOP. And so we are a credit product, not an equity product. I will say I'm a big believer in all the models, but it is important with 25 years of investment scar tissue. It's important to make sure interests are aligned whenever you do hybrid models. And one of the things I think that's nice about a debt model is that you are really hyper aligned with making sure the company can perform. And you're not in a position of trying to maximize a sale price for my sake and my investors' sake at the expense of the workers. So for us anyway, it works well in terms of aligning financial interests. But that's, so we've done 5 companies ranging from rural Oregon and a commercial nursery with 140 workers, 40 of whom, by the way, are H-2A workers from Mexico, and they're earning shares too. And all the way over to Baltimore in a heavy construction company, and everywhere in between. And, one of the nice things about employee ownership, again, to John's point, the other public policy point really is it does keep companies grounded in their communities. And we're seeing rural America get hollowed out. We're seeing small town America, I'll just say, when you're owned by financial investors, and if they can get a tax break by moving the company to Georgia, well, that's good for them. Not so great for the workers. That doesn't happen when you're employee owned. So
just following up on that, Michael, how do you qualify the companies in terms of the workforce? And there's a question from Mark Forsyth in the Q&A about sort of certifications on the sort of, MBE or WBE, minority business enterprise, or women. But do you have criteria or guidelines for what kind of companies or what kind of workforces you're looking for?
We do, David, and thank you. We are intent on driving these benefits to regular workers. So we have a filter that our target companies, at least half of the workforce, will be low or moderate income workers, as defined by their regional area median income. And in fact, in Fund One, over 80% of our workers are low and moderate income. So we want regular working folks, the folks who've been left behind over the last 40 years, really, to have the benefits of ownership. It is broad-based, so everybody gets to benefit, but that's one of our filters. And it's an important one for us.
Well, great. That is a good segue. Jack, take yourself off mute, please. There you go. Sort of bipartisan in Canada has come up. Bipartisan in the U.S. has come up. Actually, before we jump in, Jack, I just want to say on that front, we noticed the piece by Jim Sorensen and in the National Review on democratizing the American economy and expanding ownership. And maybe somebody can put that link in the chat as well. But Jack, you've been kind of working the bipartisan angle here. So tell us what the policy status is.
Sure. Well, first of all, David, I do want to echo Michael and thanking you and Rudy and the whole Impact Alpha team, not just for sort of mainstreaming employee ownership in your reporting, but just this sort of holistic thesis around the ownership economy. And I think that's so important to try to move the policy direction around the idea of how do we create more owners. And I think if we collectively can accomplish that, right, employee ownership and other ownership models become an obvious answer, right? But we have to start asking that question and encourage others to do that. And a big thank you to Lindsay and the support from the Sorensen Impact Foundation. And you mentioned Jim's piece with Terry Keeley in National Review. I mean, I think a really exciting to pull in both ESOPs and broader employee ownership as a way to develop asset building and to sort of contextualize it into this broader sort of pro-worker agenda that, to your point, David, we do have a bipartisan moment here. We have had one, for some time on employee ownership, which has always been a strong bipartisan issue. But I often get asked these days, right, what's the status of the political environment right now, and sort of new Congress, new administration? Where does employee ownership fit into all this? And my three words that I often respond with are full speed ahead. There's really been no change at all. And if anything, this is a real time for us as a field to go on offense. We've got two members of the Trump administration cabinet that were former co-sponsors of legislation that we worked on last Congress to try to support the financing of employee ownership at scale. Both Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was a co-lead in the Senate along Senator Van Hollen, and then the Labor Secretary Lori Chavez DeRaymer, who of course is now in an extraordinary position to advance and deal with some of the regulatory pain points, particularly in the ESOP side of the field that the field has struggled with for a long time. So, I think we have a real window of opportunity here, and it's exciting that we can push things forward. In terms of your earlier question, David, how are we going to ramp up the capital deployed in employee ownership? I think I've always viewed sort of two answers to that question. The first is we need pioneers like Michael, NANH, and Malini. And what John's done with Social Capital Partners and the Taylor Guitars deal a few years ago with Hoop. We need those pioneers, those leaders, those early adopters to sort of show the art of the possible. And then, where we sit at Lafayette Square Institute is trying to look at, well, what are the public policy levers that we can pull on a bipartisan basis to expedite the development of the field and really, ramp up the capital that's deployed, to Alison's point, to really speed up the pipeline of funds, right? Because private equity, it's a long theory of change, right? I mean, Alison went through, various fund cycles before you really get traction, right? How can we try to expedite that process and de-risk this strategy for investors? And, looking back to history, right, we didn't get 30-year home mortgages by accident, right? There were a number of financing interventions, right, over the course of the 20th century that, effectively created a new market, right, that didn't exist. And even in other countries, right, you can't get a 30-year fixed rate home mortgage, right? That's something that we created and which spawned an entire private lending industry. The same is true of de-risking small business lending, right? Which nobody knew you could make a profit on until the SBA showed up and its predecessor agency. So, we really view public policy as a necessary ingredient to really scaling up this field, right? We know that we can de-risk opportunities to expand employee ownership with credit enhancement. One of the things that Michael and the ANH team have done so well and demonstrated is that if we can reduce the reliance on selling owners to self-finance the transaction over a number of years, we can really drive down the opportunity cost. What we've learned is that tax incentives, and John alluded to this in Canada, they're absolutely critical to get the conversation started to incentivize sellers to consider this path, but they're not sufficient, and we know that. And so we have to find ways to improve the level of liquidity to effectively, compete better vis-a-vis other options, right? And that doesn't need to be a zero sum with institutional capital sources. It's, I think the theory of change here is quite the opposite. Is how do we ensure that institutional investors at scale have the right incentives so that they can both serve their investors while also serving the workforce across these companies and create more employee owners.
Follow-up question here, Jack. I know you've been spending much of your time on Capitol Hill just speaking with legislators around 535 Insight, your new database, which contains so much data around employee and homeownership as well as affordable housing. Can you talk about what the response has been and what they're saying, having now access to so much of this data?
Sure. Well, thanks, Rudy, for the shout out. To take a step back, we've got a great data capability in part through our affiliation, with the for-profit side of the house with Lafayette Square. And what we wanted to do coming into this year and this new Congress is really get very specific and sort of, bolster the field's analysis of the place-based impacts of employee ownership. And so we put out what we're calling 535 Insights. What's 535 all about? There are 435 U.S. members of the House of Representatives and 100 senators. So 535 members, these voting members of Congress. And what we've done is and we've done this both around employee ownership and the silver tsunami, but also with a work stream my colleague David Williams leads around housing and investment opportunities and trying to solve housing supply issues. But we've put out for every member of Congress in the House and Senate a cut of data that's showing exactly what's the level of employee ownership, the number of employee-owned companies, and particularly ESOPs in your district today as a starting point, but also tying back to the discussion with John around economic sovereignty and domestic ownership. What we've taken a look at is what are the quote unquote critical industries in a given district. In other words, industries that have been designated by either the Department of Commerce or the Homeland Security or the Defense Department that have some relationship to national security or emerging technologies that are critical to national security. And what we found is over half of those businesses in the aggregate are owned by baby boomers, right? And so, the case that we were making to policymakers and that's been well received is, well, if we lose some of these businesses, if they get sold to buyers that aren't going to maintain production here in the United States, or they close for lack of a buyer altogether, we have a whole bunch of small manufacturers that fit this profile, then that may very well be a risk to our industrial base. And in this moment where both sides of the aisle have really come together to say, what, we actually do need to think critically about how are we prioritizing domestic production, what's our industrial capacity as we're thinking about competing strategically on the world stage. Our argument has been that business succession needs to be considered a risk. And there's no greater opportunity to keep those businesses, that productive capacity and that local employment and investment here in the US, and true of other countries that are looking at this model through employee ownership.
Terrific, Jack. Let's folks, I want to give everybody a chance to have another crack at it and have a final say. And just as you're thinking about that, just to clarify a couple things, or not clarify, but amplify that. When you said, alternatives of that business owners might have for selling out, I think folks often think, oh, you could sell to your competitor. In some cases, you could sell to private equity is often the case. And what's coming together now, I think, and we've seen a couple examples of, the private equity firms that also have employee ownership are now, and we are now coming into the game. And so there is sort of a convergence around this. And I think we saw, I think it was KKR that won a deal. I believe it was Simon & Schuster, in part because they had an employee ownership plank to their pitch, and that became a competitive advantage for them. So there is kind of a convergence here that we don't see in a lot of the stuff we cover. And part of it is bipartisan, and part of it is sort of just these business advantages. So if one of you can hit on a question that's in the Q&A around another form of ownership that we haven't touched on as much as multi-stakeholder worker cooperatives. One of the examples, obviously, people know from longstanding is Mondragon in Spain. But if somebody can work that in, then Johan Wong will be happy. Maybe I know, Alison, you got to jump, so maybe you get the first crack, and then you can take off, and then John, you're queued up after that.
We're happy to, yeah. And, I'll just double down on some of the things Jack was saying about the importance of employee ownership to every community across the United States, right? This is not something that is specific to any one area. And in fact, it might be even more needed in our rural communities because of the risk of not finding a buyer for that business is even higher in places that have a less dense population. Right. So the importance of this strategy for so many components of, our future as a country is so critical. And, the question in the chat about Mondragon, there are many efforts in the United States to individual organizations that are saying, oh, we want to model work after Mondragon. So there's a union worker co-op initiative. There's Obron Cooperatives, which is a holding company of cooperatives. There are a number of different efforts. There are also concepts of multi-stakeholder cooperatives, standalone entities that exist. I was involved in helping a food hub in Sonoma County, Feed Sonoma, become a multi-stakeholder farmer and worker cooperative. But I will say that the familiarity, again, back to the rural tie-in, of cooperatives in rural communities, given the dependence on rural electric cooperatives, the dependence on food cooperatives, really sort of sets the stage for employee ownership to already have some level of familiarity in those communities.
Great. John?
Thanks, David. And I'm glad Alison touched on Mondragon because I can't pronounce it that way. That was very impressive. Look, so I think for those who are from the impact and the philanthropy community that are on the call, my observation over the last 6 or 7 years trying to bring capital to ESOPs in the US is that community has really struggled to help in a meaningful way. And my challenge would be, I think the single biggest way that community could support would be with a very large, call it a $500 million impact debt fund, whose purpose was to enhance the due diligence of all of the groups that are out there doing it now. Like, think about Common Trust, who works to convert companies to EOTs all over the country. If they knew they had a standing commitment from an impact debt fund that the first 1 times cash flow was going to be financed at an attractive rate of interest, how much more powerful would their sales pitch be? If Apis and Heritage had 1 turn of cash flow at a competitive rate or a below competitive rate, that impact debt fund would be repaid, right? These are businesses that do not default on their debt. So that money would come back, but the amplifying ability of that facility in this community would outstrip any other activity that the philanthropic or impact community could possibly do.
Terrific. We've got our charge here. Thank you. We can't get Malini, of course. Michael, but if there's a question here about sort of impact washing and whether there's a thesis of there's a risk of misaligned capital flooding the market, and how to make sure that impact is sticky. So if you want to work that into your final thoughts as well.
Is that to me, David?
Yeah, if you have it, if you don't, but that's one of the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, so appreciate it again. Appreciate the gathering. Couldn't, basically dittos to everything that people have said so far. I think there is always going to be a risk that some people are not in it for the right reasons. So that's kind of on the investor to understand what's motivating the fund manager. Certainly, if you look at microfinance as an example, there are examples of not great actors out there. And yet you can't deny that literally hundreds of millions of people around the globe have been benefited from this new asset class. I think we take care of that by making sure we are investing in companies that have that essential workforce that Malini talked about. I do think at some level that employee ownership is a benefit all by itself, no matter who's the employee. We have to create, we have to move away from an economy where 0.1% of people own as much assets as the lower 50%. Like, that's just not a sustainable society. I think everybody can understand that.
Terrific. Thank you, Michael. And Jack, I always think it's you know, we got into this a little bit in recent weeks with the flap over the CDFI fund, the Community Development Financial Institution Fund, and also rallied a very considerable bipartisan support because of sort of the common sense need for financing for small businesses, not a particularly controversial idea. Ownership is kind of on that track to becoming kind of just common sense. You know, is that utopian thinking, or is that where we're headed?
I think it's radical pragmatism, David, and I think, you know, I've been heartened by you know getting together with members and their staff on both sides of the aisle. You know, believe it or not, there really is still a bipartisan appetite to do constructive work, and you know, whether it's making it easier for people to build wealth through their jobs and companies through employee ownership, or trying to deal with housing insecurity and building wealth through home ownership. Pretty much everybody wants to work on these issues in the Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I think it's really incumbent upon this community, both employee ownership specifically, but I think the impact investing community more broadly, to really take the reins on that and lean in and find those opportunities to capitalize and go on offense, because the demand is there, and it's a question of are we going to supply the right kinds of public policy interventions and the data to support them to actually move these markets to where we want to go.
Terrific. Well, Lindsay, I want to cue you up if you want to have a final thought as well, but I've got one after that.
No, thank you so much for hosting this, David. It's great to continue this conversation, and thank you all for this incredible content.
Well, thank you all for joining. I will say that we're trying to do our part to kind of stitch this together, and ownership is a key plank of what we're calling reconstruction, construction. And as Zulema said at the top, we've got a spring tour starting next week in Asheville, North Carolina, where we'll be at the Neighborhood Economics Conference, and then down to Chapel Hill and UNC. And if folks have been following Impact Alpha, you can't miss that we've produced a documentary around Napoleon Wallace, who's down there in the Durham area, and then on to Washington, D.C., where on the eve of the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum, we'll have another event with our partners at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And then I'm pleased to say we've been accepted into the Boston International Film Festival in Boston, and that'll be on April 12th, Saturday. So we're going to be all over the place, particularly on the East Coast. We'll try to have some more West Coast things out here as well. I don't know, Isaac, do we have this minute reel that we can show folks? And then folks, thank you very much, and I won't say any more. So have a look at our recent production here from Caesar. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you. I hope to see you at one or another of those events or at our next call. I appreciate everybody's support and help, and have a great rest of your day.